Maybe poetry is a big part of your family life. Maybe you read poetry together. Maybe you enjoy poetry. Maybe you don't. Maybe you avoid poetry like the plague. But this year, in eighth grade, we are going to spend some time looking at poems on a regular basis. About every other week, I'll assign you a poem, and the expectation is that you'll read it um, for so many reasons. Read it to enjoy it because poetry is beautiful. Read it to understand it, and read it to share it and discuss it in community in our class. So here's a quote. You could add this to your commonplace book if you like, from Percy Shelley. He said, "Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar." So that may be a bit of a lofty quote. Another one that I could share with you is a paraphrase that I guess from Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He said, "Poetry is using the best words in the best order." And a poet is constrained a little bit by a certain form or a certain idea and has to use the very best words in the very best way to convey a poem. Let's see. Edgar Allan Poe, who's the poet, I hope you are not, well, um, certainly a poet, also a short story author that I hope you're familiar with. If not, you'll read him certainly in American Lit. He says that poetry is the rhythmical creation of beauty. So here we have two rather famous poets who call poetry beauty. That's interesting. And this year, as we read the poems, I want to give you a few tips. Excuse me, I got a scratchy voice this morning. Allergies, I think. Number one, don't overemphasize the meter. Now, that just simply means that a lot of poems have a certain rhyme or pattern, and some people read them too rhythmically. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail and pour the waters on the Nile on every golden scale? Right? Like da 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 da. Okay, that great way to kill a poem, right? To just read it very sing-songy. So don't overemphasize the meter. We're looking at the words, we're looking at the meaning. The meter we will look at, but it's not going to inform us necessarily on how we recite the poem. Number two, don't stop hard at the end of a line. Poems have lines and stanzas, and sometimes the line will end at the end of the line, right? But the thought doesn't end. It's going to continue into the next line. You don't have to memorize that. We'll work on poems and you'll see that. And we'll talk about that together in class. And the third thing is, I think it's really important to read through a poem several times in order to understand it. We're in this kind of modern culture that says, I have to read this poem, check, done, moving on, right? But I think it's important to sit with the poem and to spend time with the poem, to read it a few times, to really get familiar with it, to get to know it in order to understand it and even enjoy it. So, those are some things that I think are important when approaching poetry this year. Also, I want to just share with you that poems have layers, right? So, the first time you read a poem, you're just going to read it to enjoy it. You may not totally understand it yet. But what do you see? What's fun? What's jumping out at you? You're just kind of reading it. It's a first read. And then on a second read, you might see, okay, what's the form? What's going on here? What's the shape of this poem? And we'll talk about that specifically later. Layer three is that you're okay, I'm going to read it again and I'm going to try to read it and really focus on what does it mean? What is the poet saying? What is the message here? Or what is the theme? What's the big idea? And then another layer that I like to say is personal reflection. You're reading it again to see, okay, what does this remind me of? And what do I think? What can I share in class that's interesting about this poem? So, four approaches to poetry. And we're going to look at each of those individually as we begin to look up poetry. Let me start with a very simple one, just by way of example. So you might be familiar with Lewis Carroll. He's famous for the Jabberwocky. He's famous for Alice in Wonderland. This is a poem called The Crocodile, and I picked it because it is short and it's relatively easy. And it will lend itself well as an example for us for how we're going to approach poetry this year. So let me just do what I said. I'll read it together. We'll read it. All right. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spreads his claws, and welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. The Crocodile by Lewis Carroll. All right. So that's a fun poem. And I'm sure uh, kids and adults alike can find something to appreciate from Lewis Carroll there. Let's read it again. And this time, let's kind of look at the form. What is the shape of the poem? What do you see? And there are some terms that I want us to become familiar with in poetry. And you can write these down if you want, but I don't know that you have to. I really just want to introduce them to you because we're going to look at poems every other week and we're going to do this all year. And I think we'll create a rhythm. I think you'll understand what we're doing. But poems have stanzas, they have lines, they have a certain rhyme scheme. Let's look back at the crocodile. So a stanza is a group of lines. That's all it is. So as you look at the crocodile, how many stanzas do you see? How many groups of lines do you see? You probably said two, and you would be right. There are two stanzas to this poem. Another thing about form is lines. Let's look at the poem. How many lines per stanza? 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's 4. So note, when I'm looking at a poem, one of the things I do is I just jot down on a piece of paper form. And then I include what I notice about the form. That there are 2 stanzas here. 1, 2. That there are 4 lines per stanza. You can see that easily. I'm not going to address rhyme scheme right now because I'll introduce that later when we do another poem. But I did go ahead and write here A, B, because crocodile and Nile rhyme, tail and scale rhyme. And then C, D, because grin and in rhyme. So I assigned them the letter C. Claws and jaws rhyme. So I assigned them the letter D. But we'll do rhyme scheme later with another poem. So I'm going to read it again, and I want to look for literary devices. That's the next thing. And literary devices, that sounds so formal, doesn't it? It just really means, all those great skills that you've already learned and will relearn this year. Similes, metaphors, and I'll throw one at you today just because it's evident in the crocodile. I'll tell you what it's called, and I've written it down because it's something that jumped out at me as I was reading it. How did that little crocodile improve his shining tail and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spread his claws, and welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. So one literary device that is great in poetry, you'll see it in poetry, but speech writers use this, essay writers use this, and we'll probably talk about it again. It's called anaphora. And you don't, again, need to write that down or memorize it. But anaphora is simply the repetition of a word at the beginning of a clause or sentence. So notice, you probably noticed how, that repetition, that's just called anaphora. When it happens at the beginning, same word at the beginning. And so I identified that jumped out at me. So I just circled it and then listed anaphora under literary devices. And then I'm sure one of the literary devices you're familiar with is personification. And that's what's happening here in the crocodile. This crocodile is getting these kind of human qualities, right? He's spreading his claws. He's welcoming. He has hospitality, right? Crocodiles don't have hospitality. People do. His smiling jaws. Do crocodiles smile? No, people do. So that's personification. So that jumped out at me too. So I wrote that down. So another layer of poetry, like we talked about right here, see layer 3, is to read for meaning. What is happening here? What is Lewis Carroll doing? Now, short poem, don't want to overthink it too much, but let me read it one more time. How did the little crocodile improve his shining tail and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spread his claws, and welcomes the little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. So I feel like there's some contrast going here. Whenever you see a contrast, the poet or the author is doing something, right? So jaws, when I think of jaws, certainly think of like a shark, but in terms of a crocodile, the jaws, they are not friendly. They are not welcoming. They are not, I don't want to see an alligator or crocodile, their great big jaws come clamping towards me. That just reminds me of danger or death, right? Destruction. But the poet pairs this idea of jaws and claws with these happy words, grin and smiling and welcoming. So he's doing this opposite thing right here. And so when I try to think about what is Lewis Carroll doing, one, he's just having fun with words and having fun with an image about a crocodile. But there's more to it here, I think. I think the crocodile is actually dangerous, right? But he appears gentle, he appears polite. And in reality, he pursues his prey and he is not polite. He is not hospitable. His intent is to eat, destroy, right? And I could develop that a little bit further. All I did was write basically what I was just thinking there. But I could say that sometimes dangerous things look appealing. Sometimes dangerous things, destructive things, things that are going to hurt you, look good. They look fun. They look welcoming. It looks cool, right? But at the heart of it, it's a crocodile that wants to eat you, that wants to destroy you. So I don't know that I'm reading more into what Lewis Carroll is doing here, but I definitely see this contrast. And contrasts, opposites, make me think, what's going on? This crocodile here, he looks so cute, but he is a predator. All right. So the last thing I like to do with the poem is personal reflection because I think poetry is personal. The author is doing something and he's saying something, but I'm engaged with it too, and I'm getting something out of it. And my simple response to this reminds me of that song. I think it's from Peter Pan. Never smile at crocodile. No, you can't get friendly with the crocodile. All right, I'm not a great singer, but it's that wonderful little ditty about you can't get friendly with a crocodile. He might be oh, what does it say? The lyrics say, I think, don't be taken in by his foolish grin. He's imagining how well you'll look beneath his skin. Those are the lyrics of that song. And I think that just is echoing the same thing that Lewis Carroll is doing here in The Crocodile. Don't be taken in. Don't be fooled by the smile of a crocodile. All right. So 4 things we looked at: form, literary devices, theme, and personal reflection. Every time I give you a poem this year, this is what we're going to do. And my hope is that as we look at poetry, that the very first thing is that you'll enjoy it. You'll think it's interesting, or at least come to appreciate it. And I think that's something I've had to do on my journey. I know in poetry, um, I'll just confess that I read poems really quickly, and I'm often thinking, okay, I don't understand that, so I'm moving on. But if you slow down and you stop and you think and you read it several times over the course of a week, I think a poem will begin to work on you, to work in your head, to work on your heart, and you'll be able to see some things that you might not have seen the first time you read it. So, our approach this year is to read poetry every other week. I might throw more poems at you in class on our off week. But our goal is to enjoy the poem and then to look at its form, its literary devices, its theme, and its a personal reflection. We'll do this in class next week with another poem, and then you'll have homework with a third poem. And hopefully, just looking at this one will give you a pattern for what we're going to do in class. All right. God bless you. And I'm excited to go on this journey with you, learning some poems this year.